I am here chatting with our Klamath County District Attorney, Eve Costello, and you have been in this position now for how many years?
Since May of 2017.
Okay, all right. And before we just release it to the floor, and you can tell us maybe a little bit about how you got into both law and then where you're at currently, there's one question that always comes up, and I'm sure you've probably heard it plenty of times, but so many new people, whether they're young or not, have a misconception that a police officer doesn't actually charge someone with a crime, and yet that police officer is in essence acting as an entity to investigate the issue, take custody of the individual, and then it is truly the DA's office that is the actual charging entity or instrument.
Correct.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have any? That's been a misconception, I think, for a very long time. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Hollywood?
Could be, yes.
I mean, that would be my only thing is Hollywood. So law enforcement does the investigation. It should be just the facts, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Figure out what you can get from the different scenarios, talk to as many witnesses as possible, and prepare a report. And then we review that report, keeping in mind what case law is at the time, what legal definitions are, and then we make the charging decision. Certainly law enforcement officers suggest in their police report and by when they make an arrest what they think the charges are. And so that's a routine conversation that we have with law enforcement officers, especially young officers, that, well, you may think that that's what that is, but that is not what we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Right. And then we make that charging decision based on our knowledge of the laws. For example, one of the areas where that's very true is kidnapping. Kidnapping has Oregon Supreme Court decisions that make it very clear what kidnapping is and what kidnapping is not. And a lot of time, most law enforcement officers will put down a kidnapping offense and then arrest them on that, which of course is a Measure 11, and it has the $50,000 bail. And then we look at it and go, well, not the way the Oregon Supreme Court is reading it. That is not a kidnapping, and we don't charge it. Then oftentimes the young officers are upset with us because of that, but that is our job. So
right, and it's the unique relationship that law enforcement has with a district attorney's office of when I try and explain to some of my students, and I even talk about my own history, and I'm hoping we can chat about yours too, but I came from a hard science and I worked as, in essence, as an engineer, and yet I never felt more intellectually challenged than as a state trooper, police officer, right. and trying to keep up with case law, especially search and seizure laws, right. that seemed like they changed almost every month. And yes, I was most certainly in that young officer position where I was not necessarily paying attention as much to case law or things like that, but rather of, well, in my mind, this, it fit that. Right. And then some older troopers, and I'm wondering how often this happens, because it happened quite a bit to me, but where as an officer you investigate a case and you're just scratching your head, and it's not a case where it's a mandatory arrest, like it's not right. a domestic disturbance, but rather it's just a convoluted issue. Oftentimes I would write up as detailed of a report as possible and then inform the parties involved that this whole information was going to the district attorney's office yes. in order for your office to, or other DA offices, to make a decision. And just out of curiosity, how often do you think that happens as far as the percentages of the total cases that law enforcement generate and they strictly just refer it to the DA's office for their decision? I
would say that maybe 30% of the cases are ongoing investigations that have been referred to us. They will oftentimes, we will be involved in that. There is, the subpoena ducis tecum process, which is where we use the grand jury to get a subpoena to go after private records, whether those are bank records. So that's very true that those investigations are handed over to us before an arrest has been made, especially in financial crimes or money laundering crimes. Sometimes nowadays in what we refer to as ECSA, which is encouraging child sex abuse, which is the video of young children doing icky sexual things.
Yep.
And those we have to chase and try to locate. And so we get subpoena ducis tecum to get into a phone, to get into Google, to get into Facebook, to get into who knows what different social media website is carrying that. Right now we're chasing the dark web like crazy, and it's almost impossible to locate a lot of those people. But those are oftentimes where we don't go forward right away. We also have had, it was in the news early this year, we had the luxury of finally solving a 1978 homicide of a young couple. Sadly, the perp had passed since then, but we were able to bring closure for that family. And that was an ongoing investigation. We have a number of those actually right now, probably about a dozen homicide cases. They have no statutes of limitations. So that continues to happen. We get a clue, we chase that clue, law enforcement chases the clue, and we continue to keep that open. So that definitely happens as well. But a lot of them are simple, shoplifting, Deweys, an assault, disorderly conduct, criminal trespass, those kind of cases, or PCS, right? If you're in possession of the drugs, it's pretty clear that you're in possession of the drugs. So.
Yeah, it's not someone else's pants that they're wearing.
No, but that argument is made routinely, so that the wrong trousers defense from Wallace and Gromit, we've seen that many times. Now, oddly enough, sometimes the person's trousers who they borrowed, substantially larger than them, but somehow they still were wearing that person's trousers, right?
Yes. Well, I do want to thank you for working on those cold cases, because I recall back when I was working before my medical retirement, I was actually assigned a couple of cold cases, and it was because you and your office, in essence, requested that there be some attention be brought back to some of those cases. And even ones from so long ago, when I was able to contact just a couple surviving family members, just the fact that we were still trying to do something with it, they were so appreciative of it. I mentioned just a little bit of my history, but your history, did you always know that you wanted to end up as a district attorney, or did you just have an emphasis on law when you were younger?
I just had an emphasis on law, and I started my career out as a criminal defense attorney, actually. And I was very interested in our Constitution and in the success that our country has had in creating something other than the OK Corral, and a system that is relatively, given all the human errors that we have, bias, bad relationships, undue influence, those things still play in the system, unfortunately. But we've done a pretty good job of creating a civilized manner of dealing with the worst behavior of humanity. So I went in, and the jobs that were easiest available at the time were criminal defense. I started out here as a criminal defense attorney. It's intellectually stimulating. I can say most of my clients took deals, right? Most of the criminal defendants plead out. They do so because they know they're responsible, that they did it. There are those who do not, and some of those are actually innocent. And fortunately in this county, we have been able to, over the years, mostly maintain a good relationship between prosecution and defense, where we try to make sure that those cases where the individual is innocent get moved to the side and dismissed. Doesn't always happen.
Right.
There's always that risk. Our biggest fear as prosecutors, in my mind, should be that we convict an innocent person. So our job is to do justice. And justice is not to win or lose a trial.
Right.
Justice is to do the right thing at all points. And sometimes that requires some tough discussion with law enforcement, with those who are involved, and with people who perceive themselves to be victims. You get tunnel vision sometimes, and you have to take that off and just look at it from a broad scope, kind of more like Sherlock Holmes does, and figure out what actually happened here and who should we charge, and go that way. So I did that for quite a while, and then I did capital case defense, which means that I was defending individuals who had, in all but one case, actually killed somebody. And then it was essentially, and the state was asking for the death penalty, and we were essentially mitigating that and trying to get them life with a minimum of 25 or something like that. And those cases, you are required to go 3 generations back and meet their entire families and everything and understand their whole background. So that was what I was doing then. That got rather exhausting and emotionally draining. And so when the DA's position came available here, I thought, it's kind of, my husband used to be a prosecutor. Prior to that, he was a defense attorney, and then he was a prosecutor again, and now he's a defense attorney. And I was a defense attorney, and now I'm a prosecutor, and we like to look at it as this way. It's still baseball. We're still playing the same rules. And it's just that I went from playing for the Chicago Cubs as a defense attorney to playing for the White Sox. I win a lot more now. So I enjoy this, and I wanted to be at home more, and I love this community, so I thought this was a good way to serve. And there wasn't a whole lot of people that were super interested in doing it, that had the experience that I did, and so I thought it was a good idea.
From your personal experience, what was more emotionally draining and demanding, defense or in prosecution?
I think it's different. I'm not going to say more or less. It is incredibly difficult to sit with a family and explain to them that your son had a gun, and yes, he's dead and the other person's not, but the way our community looks at that, it's not an intentional homicide. It's a criminally negligent homicide. They get 7-8 years, not life or death is oftentimes what family members want. So that's very emotionally exhausting. But it was emotionally exhausting. The most emotionally exhausting was doing the capital cases. And that was because we were ethically required to reach out and meet with the victim's family and meet with our defendant's family. And a trend that had started happening was oftentimes those families would get together and they would discuss things. And so there you have, usually they're boys, you have 2 families that have lost 2 sons. And there's nothing you can do to fix it. Nothing.
Right.
You're just trying to clean up a mess. You're going to the battlefield after the bodies are laid out there and you're picking it up. That's all you're doing. If people, if students, I always tell students who come in and are interested in this, if you want to fix things, go into counseling. If you want to prevent things, go into counseling, or go become a doctor, or go do something like that. Because this is really not fixing things. It's trying to start the healing process. But you're not there when they finally reach that point where they go, oh, I think I can accept this and move on. You're just looking at all kinds of collateral damage that happened. And when you dig into a defendant's life and you dig into a victim's life, you usually see a plethora of horrible things that have happened to them over their lifetime that now just collided together in a horrific event. And now you're trying to hold somebody accountable, which should happen. And then you're trying to tell the victim, well, here's the resources, please go. But you can't make her go or him go.
Right. Did you have this strong sense of justice even when you were young? So let's say on the schoolyard when you saw a bully, did you...
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
My dad said my dad and my grandfather on my mom's side both said, life is not a spectator sport. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. If you stand as a spectator while something like that is happening, you are now making a choice because you're part of the problem. So I was like that when I was a kid. My dad did never ask a question. If we said so-and-so was doing something to so-and-so and I stepped in, Dad would go, all right, we'll take you home and get an ice cream on the way. Right.
So for some of my students, they are still, even though they're attending criminal justice, they're still really searching for what they want to do in life. And what is some of your advice to a 18, 19-year-old who is still trying to find themselves? Because it definitely sounds like, and I've worked a fair amount of cases with you, that you fit into this niche wonderfully, and you appreciate that. Just like how I felt I really fit into my law enforcement niche, and wouldn't have wanted to have done any other job besides that at that time frame. What would you say to the 18 and 19-year-old, or even I had a 45-year-old student just this last term who was reinventing himself after serving about 20 years. What would you say to those people who do not have a sense as strong as either you or I of what they wanted to do?
I would say dabble, go see. I mean, you're in college, take a bunch of different classes, look at stuff, look at stress level, look at time away from family, look at what are you wanting out of this. I think I have a strong sense of justice. I don't have a strong sense of advocacy for one side or the other. I want to figure out how we can make this a little bit better than the mess that we have there. If you are really wanting to help somebody get somewhere where they're healed, then maybe, like I said, counseling is a good idea, or being a doctor or a nurse. We're going to have a high range of need for nurses. But this is emotionally exhausting for a lot of people. It makes a lot of people bitter. I'm sure you've seen that.
Oh, yes.
It can eat at your soul. So if you don't think you're able to separate yourself from your job, I don't know that this is a great job for you.
Good point. And on that topic, it's something that my students will pretty much ask every single guest speaker. But if one of my students who's 18 years or older wanted to do a job shadow or a day shadow, or in essence, a ride along in the office, does your office offer that, or does the student need to be in like a recognized program that's leading them into law?
It needs to be a program that's leading them into law. There certainly is opportunity to look at the docket and come and watch a trial, because trials are a public forum. They're always open. That's a good idea to go and do that. But we have such high confidentiality, because we're not allowed to talk outside of the office about what goes on, that we tell you're a law student, you really don't come in that kind of job shadowing realm.
That makes complete sense. That would be like a young student wanting to even just job shadow a doctor. There are so many, private information shared. And I would actually love to bring my students to a trial. But as you know, and the general public doesn't, is any given trial will have so many resets or reschedules that as a police officer, it would, gosh, happen just
so many times.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless you had that feeling, well, not even us, but unless in talking with the deputy district attorney, which for our students are in essence employees of your office who are doing your direction at work. They're the ones that us police officers had the most exposure to. But a DDA would say, well, I think, I don't mean to chuckle, but since it would be an abnormality, they would say, I think this one's actually going to go to trial, which was a very, like, 1 in 20, 1 in 30, maybe 1 in even 50. So anyhow, trying to get our students in to actually see a trial operating has been a little bit difficult, but
and especially during COVID, even more difficult, right? Because that would have been probably impossible, actually. But yeah, if you want to reach out to me, and I'll try to remind you when I think actual trials are coming. I mean, we have some actual ones probably coming, and those ones are going to be the more disturbing ones. Is usually the ones that end up going to trial, in my mind.
Yes, so, and that's something that you and I sadly have had to deal a lot with. One of the things that I've often told my students is, as a police officer, one of the things that I wanted to do was keep the innocent and naive citizens as innocent and naive as I could, because once that it's a dark world that you have to work with and your staff. I mean, there can be some definite good things and feeling that justice has been done, but it can be really tough, especially in investigating person-on-person assaults and homicides and sex abuse and child pornography and all the things that you and I could probably talk about for quite a while. But it definitely takes a very specific sort of an emotional and mental mindset to be able to work with that. So and I talk a lot to my students of find out what the burnout rate is, or find out what their turnover rate is. And so, like I've pointed out, and I'll be doing an interview with a couple of folks from DHS, but you know, the burnout rate for them is, gosh, anywhere between 1 and 3 years for new employees of that they're just being exposed to things that are really rough. What do you think the burnout rate in general is for district attorneys' offices as far as the deputy district attorneys?
So right now we have an incredibly high burnout rate, and we also have an incredibly low attraction rate. So deputy district attorneys are not making very much. If I come out of law school, the average debt for a law school student, and that's average across our country, so I think it's pretty high actually here in Oregon, is $147,000. So you're $147,000 in debt when you get out of law school. And then when you go and work for a district attorney's office, you do have the option of 10 years from now, they'll forgive all of your debt. But in the meantime, you might be working 60 hours a week. You're not making as much as you would in private practice, or even as much as you would in public defense right now. They're kind of similar once you get to a certain skill level, but there is a push right now because the courts have said we do not have enough defense attorneys in the state of Oregon. We need more defense attorneys. The defense attorneys just got a bump in pay and a cap on the caseload that they can take because they have to provide adequate assistance of counsel, which is a constitutional standard. That all gets funded by the state. Our founding fathers, in their wisdom, decided that the counties are uniquely responsible for paying for the deputy district attorneys. This means that Deschutes County makes a lot more than Klamath County does. And that's because their tax base is better. Their caseload is also therefore lower. So we've lost a couple of DDAs to counties where they make more, or they go to a federal prosecutor's position, which makes a lot better salary as well as better benefits and that stuff. We are really working closely with the Board of Commissioners, and I have to say that Kelly Minty Morris in particular has been doing a great job trying to help us figure out how to do that. I have asked for 8 DDAs. That's what I started with. Well, I started with 7, went to 8. Then we didn't fill those positions and the board took those positions away from us. I want those positions to always sit open so that when we have the opportunity to hire somebody, we're able to hire them. So I think the burnout rate is pretty high. I think that it's emotionally exhausting, like you were saying. I find it funny that a lot of people want to watch all of these icky shows and the CSI and all of that, and the horrible movies and the murder and and it's like, to me, that actually happens. And I've actually seen stuff like that. I really don't want to do that. I like cartoons and children's movies. Those are my favorite. And books that are just off the wall strange. Terry Pratchett, Christopher Moore, Carl Hyacin. Let's just go down that pathway into a bit of a fantasy world, because it is very emotionally draining.
Yes. Yep. I watch a lot of cooking shows with my wife.
Excellent. See?
Even though I do not cook, but there is definitely, well, one of the things that we've often said is, show me any police officer who's been on the job for 5 years and there's some sort of PTSD. It's operable. They're able to function, but yeah. Well, as we're kind of coming to a close, this is a special niche that really does need good people who really are focused on justice and trying to bring closure. As you pointed out, it is not fixing the issue, because once it gets to this point, and even once it gets to the law enforcement's attention, it's absolutely, it's responsive. It's not progressive in. Now, granted, some of my favorite things were doing the Shop with a Cop event, or child safety seat installations. My wife would come and volunteer. I love those, because those were not the norm of just being responsive. But if, as a society, our next generation's coming up, if some of them don't realize, you know what, that is a tough job, but I think I have what it would take to do it, and I am devoted to justice, or I'm devoted to being impartial and making sure that everybody gets the same treatment, whether they're a sex offender or someone who has no criminal record. If those new generations don't step up, I mean, it's going to be even worse.
Right. It will be.
Do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to close this?
No, I think that, like I said earlier on, I do believe that our country has done a pretty fabulous job creating a system. We've gotten better. We continue to get better. DNA evidence has been a real eye-opener for us. One of the topics that is kind of touchy for folks, but we have been in certain communities incredibly racist in our application of justice. So there is a new trend in treatment courts, and those are a lot more intensive than I think the average public realizes. They require a weekly appearance until they are doing better, and then it might be bi-weekly. And the treatment providers, the court, our office, the probation department talk about their progress, about what they need. We make sure they have wraparound service. There's multiple UAs and various other things. If they're on medication, they have to be compliant with their mental health medication. That is not something that is traditionally done in a routine probation because they have so many other people to take care of. And so this really gives those people who want to address their underlying problem. And that's the thing, it's a voluntary program. They want to do it. That means they want to get rid of that problem. Then that gives them an opportunity to do that. And I think that that's been super positive. And like I said, we have had a lot of success in that compared to, so you're pushing down that recidivism rate, which I think is very important. And our probation department has been fabulous. They have done a lot of wraparound services under Kiki Parker-Rose and now under Aaron Hartman. They've just been fabulously progressive about making sure that when those people, once they get out of prison, that they are going forward. They're looking at jobs. They're doing what they need to do in treatment. They're doing what they need to do for their family. They're taking family classes. They're taking classes about how to balance a checkbook. A lot of stuff that they never got taught in their family, right? We also have private partners. Klamath Works is a fabulous partner. And that's a group of individuals that have been in the community, for most of them, their entire life. Kind of retired, and they went, wow, we keep having this problem. How can we help? And they have a program that helps people, again, just do the basics. How do I write a resume? How do I do an interview? How am I supposed to dress? How do I go shopping and manage my budget? And they have a lot of programs that start them out with jobs. Reach is involved in that. They have a couple of other programs. So I think our community is being very progressive. And I like that about Klamath Falls. I mean, we are very much, I think, balanced in the way we look at things. I think we are more libertarian than we are Republican or Democrat. And that's kind of, well, wait a minute, this is a community problem. Guess we better take care of it. And then the rest of the way, they're kind of like, well, do whatever you want, just don't bother us, right?
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time.